finished working on my Gettysburg Address, let me tell you about myself. My name is Abraham Lincoln. I was born on February 14, 1809. I was born in a log cabin in Kentucky. It was 18 feet long and 16 feet wide. Yeah, that's smaller than this room. We had a dirt floor and no windows. I lived with my mother, my father, and my sister. We were all very poor. When I was 7, we moved to Indiana. We moved because Kentucky was a slave state and Indiana was a free state. For as long as I can remember, my family hated slavery. When I was 9, my mother died. It was hard and sad for me and my sister. My new mother was very good to me. She gave me lots of books. That's how I learned to read all by myself. This showed incredible determination that would help me as an adult. When I was 21, I decided to get a job. I worked at a store and studied the law to become a lawyer. When I started working, people trusted me. They came to me for my opinions and advice. Soon, they were coming to me for legal advice. At that time, there were 2 main political parties, the Whigs and the Democrats. I was a Whig, not the kind of Whig you might be thinking of. The Whigs were for stronger government, and the Democrats were for state rights. In 1842, I married Mary Todd. We had Robert and Edward. Edward died when he was 3. We had Willie and Thomas. Thomas was nicknamed Tab because he had a big head. I wanted to end slavery. I ran for Senate but lost. But the speeches I gave made me famous. Soon after that, I became president. A year later, a war broke out called the Civil War. The Civil War was a war between the North and the South. The South thought slavery should be legal, and the North thought slavery should be illegal. The second year of the war was ending, and nobody was winning. More than 100 battles had been fought, and many people had died in the war. I decided to go do something alone and without Congress. It took courage and leadership. I wrote the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation was a law that said nobody can have slaves. The Southerners didn't obey the law, but when the slaves heard the news, many of them escaped and traveled north. They would fight for the Union against their own masters in the South. By 1863, it was getting hard to find people to fight in the war. People were tired of the war and willing to just let the Confederate Army win. People were starting to blame me for everything. Americans relied on me to explain why the war had to be fought to the bitter end. This is what I made my famous speech, the Gettysburg Address. And here it is right here. I spoke for only 2 minutes. I talked about how all men were created equal, and how all men were created equal. I talked about how this country was founded and the Union was fighting to keep the United States united. This was one of the most important speeches ever written. In 1864, I was elected for my 2nd term as president. In 1865, the war was coming to an end. The leader for the Confederate Army was forced to surrender. The Civil War was finally over. A few months later, Abraham Lincoln was sitting in the theater with his wife, having a peaceful time. That's when John Wilkes Booth snuck up on Lincoln and shot him. He died the next morning. He was 56 years old. Now, 150 years later, he is still remembered as one of the best presidents the United States has ever had. He kept our country together in one of its worst times. He stopped slavery. He kept the United States united.